Picture this: a towering wooden beast creaking under its own weight, ropes groaning as a massive counterweight drops, sending a deadly projectile soaring through the air to smash through fortress walls hundreds of feet away. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, a trebuchet, the ultimate siege machine of the Dark Ages. In a time when brute force and raw ingenuity collided, these colossal devices became the pinnacle of battlefield technology, reshaping the very nature of warfare. But what made them so revolutionary? How did medieval engineers, without modern tools or textbooks, unlock the secrets of physics to create such devastatingly precise machines? That's the story we're about to uncover. Think about the sheer audacity of it: a machine so powerful it could hurl a 200-pound stone over castle walls, or even launch flaming projectiles to strike fear into the hearts of defenders. The trebuchet wasn't just a tool of destruction. It was a symbol of human creativity pushing against the limits of its time. Behind every swing of its arm lay centuries of trial and error, of craftsmen and strategists perfecting the balance between weight, force, and trajectory. And here's the fascinating part: the principles that made trebuchet so effective are the same ones that govern modern physics today. From the careful calculation of counterweights to the precise angle of release, every detail mattered. This wasn't just medieval warfare, it was applied science at its most brutal and brilliant. So why does this matter to us now? Because the trebuchet represents something timeless: the relentless human drive to solve problems, to innovate, even in the face of overwhelming odds. These machines didn't just change battles, they changed history, forcing armies to rethink defense, inspiring new fortress designs, and proving that ingenuity could tip the scales of power. And as we dive into the mechanics, the battles, and the minds behind these war machines, you'll see how they transformed the medieval world and why their legacy still echoes in engineering today. Get ready to step into a world where science met spectacle, where every launch was a calculated dance of physics and force. The age of the trebuchet awaits. The story of the trebuchet begins centuries before its medieval heyday, with early prototypes appearing in ancient China as far back as the 4th century. These primitive versions, known as traction trebuchets, relied on teams of soldiers pulling ropes to launch projectiles, a far cry from the massive counterweight-powered machines that would later dominate European battlefields. But the real breakthrough came when this technology traveled westward along trade routes, merging with local innovations to create something entirely new. By the 12th century, European engineers had transformed the concept, replacing human muscle with the relentless pull of gravity. The result: a machine so formidable it could change the course of sieges and history itself. What set the trebuchet apart from earlier siege engines like the mangonel or onager was its ingenious use of physics. While those weapons relied on twisted ropes or sinew to store energy, the trebuchet harnessed the simple yet unstoppable force of a falling weight. Imagine a giant lever balanced on a pivot point. One end held a sling loaded with a projectile, while the other carried a counterweight, sometimes weighing several tons. When released, that weight would drop, swinging the arm with terrifying speed and precision. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a revolution in mechanical advantage. Medieval engineers, though lacking modern terminology, understood the principles intuitively. The longer the throwing arm, the greater the leverage, and the heavier the counterweight, the farther the stone would fly. The impact on warfare was immediate and profound. For the first time, attackers could strike from a safe distance, launching not just stones but also fire pots, diseased carcasses, or even messages over castle walls. The psychological effect was just as devastating as the physical damage. Nothing shattered enemy morale like the sound of a trebuchet's counterweight crashing down, followed by the whistle of an incoming projectile. Kings like Edward I of England became early adopters, using these machines to crush rebellions and conquer fortresses once thought impregnable. In the hands of skilled operators, a trebuchet could hit the same spot repeatedly, methodically weakening walls until they crumbled. Yet the trebuchet's legacy goes beyond destruction. Its design forced medieval architects to rethink fortifications, leading to thicker walls, rounded towers to deflect shots, and deeper moats. It blurred the line between brute force and scientific thinking, proving that warfare wasn't just about numbers or courage, it was about physics, geometry, and innovation. And perhaps most remarkably, these machines were built without blueprints or calculators, relying instead on generations of craftsmanship passed down through guilds and apprenticeships. Each trebuchet was a custom masterpiece, its proportions carefully tuned by artisans who understood that a fraction of an inch in the pivot point could mean the difference between victory and failure. That's the true marvel of the trebuchet. It wasn't just a weapon, but a testament to human ingenuity. In an age often dismissed as backward or superstitious, these machines stand as proof that medieval minds were capable of breathtaking sophistication. They took the raw materials of their world, wood, rope, stone, and bent them to their will, turning the laws of nature into tools of war. And as we'll see next, that ingenuity didn't stop at the battlefield's edge. The same principles that powered trebuchets would eventually inspire everything from clockwork to industrial machinery, linking the medieval world to our own. To understand why the trebuchet was so devastatingly effective, we need to break down the brilliant physics at work in its design. Picture a seesaw on a massive scale, but instead of children playing, one end holds several tons of deadweight while the other cradles a deadly projectile. When that counterweight drops, it doesn't just fall, it unleashes a carefully orchestrated chain reaction of energy. The longer arm on the projectile side acts like a whip, multiplying the force as it swings upward, while the sling adds one final twist, literally. As the arm reaches its peak, the sling releases at just the right moment, adding even more speed and distance to the throw. It's a symphony of leverage, timing, and raw power, all perfected centuries before the scientific revolution gave names to these principles. What's astonishing is how precisely medieval engineers balanced these elements without formal calculations. Take the counterweight to projectile ratio too light, and the stone barely moves; too heavy, and the machine might tear itself apart. Through generations of experimentation, they found the sweet spot, often using counterweights 10 to 100 times heavier than the projectile. Then there's the throwing arm's length, which could stretch over 30 feet on the largest trebuchets. This wasn't just for show. Every extra foot increased the arc of the swing, translating to greater speed and distance. And let's not forget the sling's critical role. Like a quarterback releasing a football at the perfect moment, the sling's sudden release added a final burst of acceleration, turning a powerful throw into an unstoppable one. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The trebuchet wasn't just brute strength. Small adjustments could turn it into a precision instrument. Changing the angle of the release pin by a hair could alter a projectile's trajectory, allowing crews to zero in on weak points in castle walls. Some accounts describe crews launching stones in high arcs to crash down onto rooftops or using flatter trajectories to batter gates. And unlike earlier siege engines, which relied on unpredictable torsion from twisted ropes, the trebuchet's counterweight delivered consistent, repeatable force. a medieval version of quality control. This consistency made trebuchets terrifyingly reliable. During the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Edward I's warwolf, a trebuchet so massive it took weeks to assemble, reportedly hurled stones weighing up to 300 pounds. But it wasn't just about raw power. Operators could adjust throws based on wind, distance, even the weight of individual stones. Imagine the skill required. No rangefinders, no calculators, just keen eyes and generations of hard-won knowledge. That's why these machines weren't just built, they were tuned, like a master luthier crafting a violin. And the innovations didn't stop there. Some trebuchets featured hinged counterweights, allowing the mass to drop more vertically, maximizing energy transfer. Others used wheels on their frames, letting the entire machine recoil forward with each shot, adding even more force. These weren't crude contraptions, they were the peak of mechanical thinking in their era. By the late Middle Ages, the trebuchet had evolved into something akin to a medieval artillery computer, programmed not with code, but with weights, lengths, and angles, each adjustment a line in an invisible equation written in wood and iron. What's humbling is realizing how much of this engineering was done by feel. Without textbooks or physics formulas, medieval builders turned intuition into precision. They understood, perhaps without articulating it, that energy could be transformed but never lost, that a falling weight could become a flying stone. In that way, the trebuchet is more than a weapon. It's a monument to human curiosity. Every time its arms swung, it proved that the world operated by rules waiting to be mastered. And though gunpowder eventually made these giants obsolete, their legacy lives on. From carnival strength test games to modern engineering challenges, the trebuchet's principles still teach us one timeless lesson. With the right leverage, even gravity can be weaponized. At the core of every great trebuchet lay its beating heart, the counterweight. This wasn't just dead mass, it was stored potential, a carefully calculated reservoir of energy waiting to be unleashed. Picture a wooden box the size of a small room, packed tight with stones, dirt, or even molten lead in the most advanced designs. When released, this weight didn't merely fall, it transformed gravity into motion, potential into kinetic fury. Some counterweights tipped the scales at over 20,000 pounds, yet their true genius lay in how they moved. Fixed weights provided brute simplicity, but the most innovative designs featured swinging boxes that dropped in a near-vertical path, transferring energy to the throwing arm with terrifying efficiency. The relationship between weight and performance followed a delicate dance. Double the counterweight's mass, and you'd think you'd double the power, but medieval engineers discovered it wasn't that simple. Too much weight risked splintering the wooden frame or snapping the throwing arm like a twig. Too little, and your projectile might barely clear the machine's own base. The sweet spot often fell between 100 to 150 times the projectile's weight, creating enough force to send stones soaring while keeping the structure intact. And here's where craftsmanship shone. Master builders would incrementally add or remove material from the counterweight box, fine-tuning performance like a musician adjusting string tension. Drop height played an equally critical role. Raise the counterweight higher, and its increased falling distance multiplied the energy transferred to the arm. But just as with weight, there were limits. Too great a drop could make the machine unstable, causing the entire frame to lurch forward violently. Some trebuchets solved this by mounting their frames on wheels, allowing controlled recoil that actually added to the projectile's momentum. Others used hinged counterweights that followed an optimal downward path, minimizing wasted motion. These weren't random experiments. They represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about how objects move through space and transfer force. What's remarkable is how these principles translated to battlefield performance. A well-tuned trebuchet could launch a 200-pound stone nearly 1,000 feet, 3 times the range of earlier torsion catapults. But range wasn't the only advantage. The counterweight's consistent pull created predictable trajectories, allowing crews to walk their shots onto targets with methodical precision. During the siege of Acre in 1291, Crusaders reportedly adjusted their trebuchets stone by stone, systematically dismantling fortress walls section by section. This reliability made them psychological weapons. Two defenders knew each thunderous crash of the counterweight meant another precisely aimed projectile was incoming. The most advanced designs took counterweight engineering even further. Some employed segmented weights that could be adjusted mid-siege, changing the machine's power without complete disassembly. Others used dual counterweight boxes that released sequentially, creating a smoother transfer of energy. These innovations show medieval minds pushing their understanding of physics to its limits, solving problems through observation and iteration rather than mathematical formulas. That a machine so precisely calibrated could be built without modern engineering tools stands as testament to human ingenuity and explains why, for nearly 500 years, the counterweight trebuchet remained the undisputed king of siege warfare. Beyond raw power, these machines demonstrated something profound: the ability to harness natural forces with precision. Every time a counterweight dropped, it proved that gravity could be calculated, that momentum could be directed, that chaos could be shaped into order. In an era before scientific method, trebuchet builders were conducting physics experiments on a colossal scale, their workshops becoming laboratories where theory met practice in the most dramatic way possible. The counterweight didn't just power the machine, it propelled human understanding forward, one earth-shaking throw at a time. The throwing arm wasn't just a wooden beam, it was the trebuchet's living muscle, flexing with stored energy before unleashing devastation. Crafted from the straightest oak or ash tree available, this critical component could stretch over 30 feet on the largest machines, turning a simple lever into a force multiplier that would make Archimedes proud. But length alone didn't guarantee success. The ideal arm balanced 3 crucial factors: leverage for power, stiffness for control, and just enough flexibility to prevent catastrophic failure. Medieval engineers discovered through trial and error that slightly tapering the arm, thicker near the axle, thinner toward the tip, provided the perfect combination of strength and whip-like acceleration. What made these wooden arms truly remarkable was how they handled forces that would shatter lesser materials. When the counterweight dropped, the arm didn't just move, it endured stresses comparable to modern bridge supports. Iron bands wrapped around critical joints acted like medieval reinforcement bars, preventing the wood from splitting under the immense rotational forces. Some designs even featured metal plates where the sling's release pin engaged, reducing wear from hundreds of violent throws. This wasn't carpentry, it was biomechanical engineering avant la lettre, with craftsmen intuitively understanding stress points centuries before the concept entered textbooks. The magic really happened at the arm's business end, where a simple rope loop or iron hook held the sling. This unassuming attachment point became the difference between a perfect shot and a dangerous misfire. Too tight a connection and the projectile would release too late, potentially crashing into the ground just feet from the machine. Too loose, and it might fly prematurely in a wild, uncontrolled arc. The solution: a carefully shaped release pin that would let the sling slip free at precisely the 45-degree angle that maximized both distance and accuracy. Some accounts suggest operators would grease these pins to ensure consistent releases, while others mention leather cushions to absorb shock. But the true masterpiece was how the arm worked in concert with the sling, a partnership more sophisticated than many realized. As the arm reached its peak velocity, the sling didn't just let go. It effectively became an extension of the lever, adding an extra few feet of acceleration. Picture a figure skater pulling in their arms to spin faster. That same principle applied here, with the rotating sling tightening its arc at the critical moment. This final burst could add up to 20% more speed to the projectile, turning what would already be a deadly throw into an unstoppable force. Watching a master crew operate a trebuchet revealed the arm's subtle artistry. Between shots, they'd inspect every inch for hairline cracks, test the pivot's smoothness, and sometimes even adjust the arm's balance by adding lead weights. These weren't just maintenance checks, they were calibrations as precise as tuning a grand piano. Historical records from the Siege of Toulouse in 1218 describe engineers shortening throwing arms mid-battle to increase the arc of their shots against particularly high walls. This level of adaptability shows how deeply crews understood their machine's mechanics. Perhaps most impressive was how these wooden arms stood up to the punishment of continuous firing. Unlike modern artillery with replaceable barrels, a trebuchet's arm had to endure hundreds of violent throws without failing. The best could launch a projectile every 3 to 5 minutes for hours on end, their arms developing a rhythmic creak that defenders reportedly could hear from besieged walls. This endurance came from selecting the right wood, often slow-growth oak for its density, and seasoning it for years to prevent warping. Some accounts suggest the most prized throwing arms were passed down through generations of siege engineers, their surfaces polished smooth by countless hands and battles. In the end, the throwing arm embodied the trebuchet's paradoxical nature, simplicity masking incredible sophistication. What appeared to be just a big stick was in fact a precisely tuned instrument of physics, its every curve and reinforcement serving a calculated purpose. When that arm finally swung, it didn't just throw stones, it hurled the collective knowledge of centuries of craftsmen, the sum total of medieval engineering wisdom given violent, beautiful form. And as we'll see, that knowledge extended far beyond the arm itself, into the very projectiles that made these machines truly terrifying. The sling might look like a simple pouch at first glance, but in the hands of a skilled trebuchet crew, it became the machine's secret weapon for precision. Woven from tough hemp rope or supple leather, this unassuming component did far more than just hold the projectile. It acted like a whip's cracking tip, adding an extra burst of speed at the critical moment. Picture a professional golfer's follow-through or a baseball pitcher's wrist snap. That same principle of delayed acceleration applied here. As the throwing arm reached its peak velocity, the sling would unfurl, effectively adding several extra feet to the lever's length. This final whip-like motion could increase the projectile's speed by nearly 20%, turning a powerful throw into an earth-shattering impact. What truly set master craftsmen apart was their understanding of release timing. The sling's attachment point to the arm wasn't fixed, it connected via a carefully shaped hook or loop designed to let go at precisely the right millisecond. Too early and the projectile would soar high but fall short, too late and it might plow straight into the ground. Historical accounts mention crews experimenting with different release pin shapes, some rounded, others angular, each subtly altering the moment of separation. Some trebuchets even featured adjustable pins that could be shifted mid-siege, allowing crews to adapt to changing battlefield conditions without rebuilding the entire machine. The sling's length played an equally crucial role. Longer slings increased the whip effect but required more clearance to operate safely, while shorter versions sacrificed some power for tighter control. Manuscripts from the 100 Years' War describe engineers carrying multiple slings of varying lengths, switching them out like a modern artillery crew adjusting barrel elevation. During the Siege of Harfleur in 1415, chroniclers noted Henry V's forces using shorter slings for accurate, high-arc shots against the town's inner defenses after longer-range slings had battered the outer walls. This level of adaptability made trebuchets far more versatile than their massive frames suggested, but the sling's genius extended beyond physics. Its design also solved one of siege warfare's oldest problems: projectile stability. Unlike earlier catapults that sent stones tumbling wildly, the trebuchet sling allowed for a smooth, spinning release. This rotation acted like a rifle's rifling, stabilizing the projectile in flight for straighter, more predictable trajectories. Some accounts even mention crews weighting one side of the sling to induce specific spin patterns, effectively curving shots around obstacles, a medieval version of guided munitions. Perhaps most impressively, these slings weren't just crude pouches but carefully engineered components. The best were made from layered leather with reinforced stitching at stress points, some even lined with sheepskin to cushion the projectile and prevent premature wear. Rope slings often featured intricate braiding patterns that distributed forces evenly, preventing sudden failures mid-throw. Maintenance was constant. After every few shots, crews would inspect for fraying strands or stretched loops, knowing that a snapped sling could send a 300-pound stone crashing into their own position. This relentless attention to detail transformed the sling from a simple accessory into the trebuchet's precision instrument. Where earlier siege engines scattered shots wildly, a well-tuned sling could land consecutive projectiles within feet of each other at 200 yards, a level of accuracy that terrified defenders. Records from the Siege of Acre describe Crusader trebuchets systematically dismantling curtain walls stone by stone, their crews adjusting sling lengths and release points like medieval snipers zeroing their sights. That a length of rope or leather could wield such controlled violence stands as testament to the Dark Age engineers who turned physics into an art form. The projectiles hurled by trebuchets weren't just blunt instruments, they were carefully chosen tools of terror, each designed to exploit a different weakness in the enemy's defenses. Massive rounded stones, often weighing hundreds of pounds, served as the workhorse ammunition, their sheer kinetic energy capable of cracking fortress walls like eggshells. But medieval engineers quickly realized the true power lay in variety. During the Siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces allegedly catapulted plague-infested corpses over city walls, turning biology into a weapon centuries before germ theory existed. This gruesome innovation showed how trebuchets could deliver more than physical damage. They could weaponize fear itself. Fire became another devastating payload. Imagine bundles of oil-soaked rags set ablaze mid-flight, or clay pots filled with a volatile mix of quicklime and sulfur that ignited on impact. The Greek fire used by Byzantine armies created unstoppable infernos that water only worsened, forcing defenders to choose between burning structures and letting flames spread. Some accounts describe projectiles designed to shatter on impact, scattering burning pitch across rooftops and creating multiple firefronts at once. The psychological effect was calculated: chaos watchmen shouting warnings as arcs of fire streaked through the night sky, each one carrying the potential to turn strongholds into tinderboxes. Then there were the more macabre choices. During the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, Crusaders reportedly launched severed heads back into the city, a brutal message meant to break morale. Other armies hurled dead animals, spoiled food, or even beehives to sow discord behind enemy lines. These weren't random acts of cruelty but tactical decisions, exploiting the fact that sieges were as much mental battles as physical ones. A fortress might withstand months of stone bombardment, but the constant dread of what might come next, whether disease, fire, or worse, could erode discipline faster than any breach in the walls. What's remarkable is how crews adapted their ammunition to specific challenges. Against stone walls, they used dense granite projectiles shaped like cannonballs to concentrate force. When targeting wooden structures, they switched to incendiary rounds. Some trebuchets even launched makeshift shrapnel barrels filled with metal fragments or sharp stones that would burst upon impact, creating deadly splinters. During one siege in Spain, attackers reportedly hurled containers of quicklime that burst into choking clouds when they hit, blinding defenders on the ramparts. This level of customization made trebuchets the medieval equivalent of multi-role combat systems. The logistics behind these projectiles reveal just how sophisticated siege warfare had become. Stone shot had to be carefully rounded and weighed for consistency. Irregular shapes caused unpredictable flights. Some castles kept stores of pre-made ammunition specifically designed to fit their own trebuchets, while besieging armies often established quarries near their positions to produce fresh rounds. Fire projectiles required special handling. Pitch had to be kept heated in cauldrons, and quicklime stored in dry conditions. Even the gruesome biological weapons demanded preparation. Corpses were sometimes left to fester for days to maximize their horrific effect. This versatility gave trebuchet crews an almost artistic range of destruction. A single machine could alternate between smashing masonry with stone shot, setting rooftops ablaze with fire pots, and then lobbing rotting carcasses to contaminate water supplies. The ability to switch tactics kept defenders perpetually off balance, never knowing whether the next thunderous crash would bring physical damage, environmental hazards, or psychological terror. In many ways, these machines anticipated modern warfare's combined arms approach, using different weapons in concert to attack an enemy's body, mind, and environment simultaneously. What began as a simple rock-throwing device had evolved into a full-spectrum siege platform, capable of waging war on every conceivable front. The trebuchet didn't just break walls, it shattered morale, disrupted logistics, and turned the very environment against those under siege. Each projectile type told a story of medieval ingenuity at its most ruthless, where every natural element and human vulnerability became fodder for the machine's relentless creativity. And as we'll see, this adaptability ensured the trebuchet's dominance until gunpowder finally changed the rules of warfare forever. Before trebuchets dominated battlefields, siege warfare was a brutal waiting game, a test of endurance where attackers camped outside walls for months, sometimes years, hoping starvation would break the defender's will. Scaling walls meant sending waves of soldiers into deadly arrow fire, while tunneling under foundations risked collapse or countermining. Then everything changed. The trebuchet didn't just add power to sieges, it rewrote the entire playbook of medieval warfare. Suddenly, towering stone walls, once considered invincible, could be systematically dismantled from hundreds of feet away, shifting the advantage decisively to the attacking force. This revolution in strategy began with range. Unlike earlier catapults that required dangerously close positioning, trebuchets could operate safely beyond arrow or boiling oil range while still delivering devastating blows. At the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204, French forces positioned their machines across the Seine River, bombarding the English stronghold day and night without risking a single soldier. The psychological impact was as calculated as the physical damage. Defenders now faced an enemy that could strike them without ever coming within sight. Walls meant safety. Trebuchets made those same walls targets. Commanders quickly realized these machines offered more than brute force, they provided surgical precision. By concentrating fire on specific weak points like gatehouses or corner towers, Attackers could create breaches while conserving ammunition. Medieval chronicles describe crews launching 20 stones at the same cracked merlon until it collapsed, then shifting aim to the next vulnerable spot. This wasn't random bombardment. It was early combined arms warfare, with trebuchets softening defenses before infantry advanced. At Stirling Castle, Edward Longshank's warwolf reportedly demolished an entire curtain wall section by section, turning a months-long siege into a matter of days. The strategic ripple effects transformed castle design itself. Architects who once relied on height and thickness began experimenting with rounded towers that deflected shots, deeper moats to keep machines at bay, and layered defenses so even breached walls led to kill zones. Some fortresses added specially reinforced chambers to house counter-trebuchets, turning sieges into artillery duels. The arms race between attack and defense escalated dramatically. Each innovation in stone-throwing technology met with new architectural solutions, pushing medieval engineering to unprecedented heights. Perhaps most fascinating was how trebuchets altered the very rhythm of sieges. Unlike starvation tactics that dragged on indefinitely, a well-organized bombardment could force surrender within weeks. Commanders began using trebuchets as bargaining chips, demonstrating their power with warning shots before offering terms. During the siege of Acre, Richard the Lionheart's forces assembled their machines but held fire, giving the defenders one last chance to negotiate. When refusal came, the ensuing bombardment became legendary, with stones reportedly crushing entire buildings in single hits. This shift in tempo changed medieval politics. Kings no longer needed vast armies to enforce their will. A few properly positioned trebuchets could make rebellion prohibitively expensive. The machines became symbols of royal authority, their components transported across kingdoms as mobile proclamations of power. When Henry III of England marched against rebellious barons, his wagon train included disassembled trebuchet parts, sending a clear message. Resistance would meet not just soldiers, but physics itself weaponized. Yet for all their advantages, trebuchets demanded more than technical skill. They required psychological mastery. Wise commanders knew when to unleash barrages and when to pause, letting the dread of the next shot erode enemy morale. Some besiegers alternated between stone and fire projectiles to maximize confusion, while others timed their attacks to coincide with meal hours or religious services. The trebuchet wasn't just a wall breaker. It was a chess piece in a high-stakes game of nerves where the threat of destruction often proved as effective as destruction itself. What began as a simple force multiplier evolved into the centerpiece of medieval grand strategy. The ability to project power over walls reshaped everything from castle placement to supply line management, from diplomatic negotiations to the very concept of territorial control. In an age where fortifications defined power, the trebuchet became the ultimate key, a machine that didn't just win battles, but redefined what victory looked like. And as we'll see, that legacy extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing warfare long after the last trebuchet fell silent. Among the most legendary displays of trebuchet dominance was the Siege of Acre in 1291, where Mamluk forces under Sultan al-Ashraf Kolul deployed a battery of these machines to dismantle the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. Contemporary accounts describe a relentless barrage, stones the size of mill wheels crashing through towers, firepots turning the sky orange, and defenders scrambling to patch breaches faster than new ones appeared. What made this siege historic wasn't just the destruction, but the calculated strategy behind it. The Mamluks positioned their trebuchets in staggered arcs, creating overlapping fields of fire that systematically collapsed entire sections of the city's famed double walls. Within weeks, a fortress that had stood for nearly 200 years lay in ruins, proving no defense could withstand physics applied with such terrifying precision. Then there's the tale of Warwolf, Edward I's monstrous trebuchet at Stirling Castle in 1304. This wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological warfare carved from timber. Records suggest it took 3 months and 55 wagonloads of timber to construct, with a counterweight rumored to hold several tons of stone. But here's the twist: the Scots reportedly offered surrender as soon as they saw its frame rising. Edward, determined to demonstrate his new war machine's might, refused their capitulation until Warwolf had launched its first shot. That inaugural stone supposedly demolished an entire section of curtain wall in a single blow, sending a message far beyond Scotland. Resistance against England's Hammer of the Scots was futile. Chateau Gaillard's fall in 1204 revealed another facet of Trebuchet strategy: the art of positioning. French forces under Philip Augustus faced a seemingly impregnable fortress built by Richard the Lionheart, perched atop sheer cliffs above the Seine. Instead of direct assault, they assembled their trebuchets on the opposite riverbank, using the water as a natural moat against counterattacks. For 8 months, their machines arced stones across the river with mathematical consistency, methodically reducing Europe's most advanced castle to rubble. The real masterstroke came when French engineers adjusted their trajectories to target the weak point Richard had arrogantly nicknamed the Weak, a slightly thinner wall section that eventually crumbled, giving attackers their breach. Less celebrated but equally telling was the siege of Toulouse in 1218 during the Albigensian Crusade. When Simon de Montfort's forces found their initial trebuchet attacks ineffective against the city's innovative rounded towers, they didn't just increase the barrage, they redesigned their ammunition. Switching from round stones to angular boulders, they created projectiles that dug into the curved surfaces rather than deflecting off. This small but crucial adaptation turned the tide, showing how trebuchet warfare demanded both brute force and creative problem-solving. Each of these battles shared a common thread. The trebuchet wasn't merely a tool of destruction, but a canvas for medieval ingenuity. Commanders didn't just build them, they orchestrated them, fine-tuning every element from projectile selection to release angles like conductors leading a symphony of stone. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the battlefield. When news spread of a fortress falling to these machines, other cities often reconsidered resistance. In an age where stone walls meant security, the trebuchet redefined what safety looked like, forcing a complete rethink of military architecture and defense strategies across continents. Perhaps most remarkably, these war machines transcended their violent purpose to become cultural touchstones. The same chronicles that recorded their destructive power also marveled at their craftsmanship: the polished wood, the intricate joinery, the almost artistic balance of their components. They stood as paradoxes, instruments of devastation that also represented the pinnacle of their era's engineering knowledge. Long after gunpowder made them obsolete, the legends of Warwolf and its kin endured, not just as tales of conquest, but as testaments to human creativity's dual edge. The same intellect that could build cathedrals could also perfect the art of tearing them down. Mastering the arc of a trebuchet's throw was less like brute force engineering and more like conducting an orchestra. Every element, from counterweight to release angle, had to harmonize perfectly to hit that sweet spot behind enemy walls. The secret lay in understanding the projectile's parabolic flight path, an invisible curve scribed by physics that medieval engineers mapped through sheer intuition. While modern artillery relies on mathematical tables and computerized targeting, trebuchet operators developed an almost artistic feel for trajectory, adjusting their machines with the precision of a master archer judging windage. The higher the arc, the steeper the descent, allowing stones to crash down onto rooftops or courtyards that direct fire couldn't reach, turning the machine into a medieval mortar capable of indirect bombardment. What made this possible was the Trebuchets' unique tuning system. Shorten the sling by a hand's breadth, and the projectile would release earlier in the swing, creating a lower, faster trajectory perfect for battering gatehouses. Lengthen it slightly, and the same machine could loft shots high over parapets to strike inner baileys. Counterweight adjustments offered even finer control. Adding just 2 or 3 stones to the weight box could extend range by dozens of feet without altering the machine's structure. Chronicles from the Siege of Lisbon in 1147 describe Christian crews making these micro-adjustments between volleys, walking their shots across Moorish defenses like a sniper zeroing in. Environmental factors added layers of complexity that separated adequate crews from true masters. A headwind required increasing the counterweight to maintain distance, while a tailwind might demand switching to heavier projectiles that wouldn't overshoot. Rain-slicked slings released differently than dry ones, and even the temperature-affected rope tension details modern recreations confirm through painful trial and error. The most skilled operators accounted for these variables instinctively, much like seasoned sailors reading subtle shifts in the wind. At the Siege of Kenilworth in 1266, chroniclers marveled at how royalist trebuchets maintained accuracy despite autumn storms, their stones striking the same damaged tower section through sheets of rain. The real testament to this precision comes from archaeological evidence. Excavations at beleaguered castles often reveal clusters of impact craters within arm's reach of each other, telltale signs of crews methodically working a weak point. At Beaucaire in France, one battered wall section shows at least 18 direct hits in a space smaller than a banquet table, suggesting the attacking trebuchet could place stones with the consistency of a modern howitzer. This wasn't luck, it was the result of crews developing standardized procedures, marking reference points on their machines, and likely using simple sighting tools like notched posts to align shots. Perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was how crews compensated for varying projectile weights, a constant challenge when ammunition might range from 50-pound quarried stones to 300-pound boulders. Rather than rebuilding the machine for each shot, operators developed mental algorithms. Heavier projectiles meant slightly reducing the counterweight or adjusting the release pin's angle. Some accounts mention color-coded stones or notches on the throwing arm that corresponded to different weight ranges, creating a crude but effective ballistic computer carved in wood. This combination of flexibility and repeatability made trebuchets terrifyingly versatile. The same machine could rain down small, rapid-fire shots to harass defenders on walls, then switch to massive boulders for structural demolition, all while maintaining enough accuracy to avoid wasting precious ammunition. When Edward I besieged Stirling Castle, his warwolf reportedly alternated between high-arc incendiary shots and low-trajectory wall breakers within the same hour, adapting to each new tactical demand without missing a beat. That level of control, achieved without protractors or slide rules, stands as one of history's great feats of applied physics, a dark age targeting system rivaling technology that wouldn't reappear until the Renaissance. In the end, the trebuchet's true genius wasn't raw power, but its marriage of might and mathematics. Every perfectly placed shot proved that medieval minds could bend natural forces to their will, transforming the simple act of dropping a weight into a symphony of calculated destruction. Long before Newton formulated his laws of motion, these war machines were demonstrating them in the most dramatic way possible, one precisely aimed stone at a time. The masterminds behind these medieval war machines weren't just skilled craftsmen, they were Renaissance men centuries before the Renaissance, blending the roles of architect, physicist, and battlefield tactician into one. Picture a grizzled expert in stained leather aprons, calloused hands adjusting wooden pegs while mentally calculating ratios of weight to distance, his knowledge passed down through generations of siege warfare. These engineers commanded respect equal to knights, their salaries often exceeding those of noble-born officers because while swords won battles, trebuchets won wars. When King Philip Augustus of France captured Château-Gaillard, chroniclers noted he paid his chief engineer more than his royal standard-bearer, a telling detail about where real power lay in medieval warfare. What set these men apart was their empirical approach to physics. Without formal training in mathematics, they developed an intuitive grasp of mechanical advantage through relentless experimentation. Manuscripts from the 13th century show engineers methodically testing different arm lengths, recording how each extra foot increased range. Others detail trials with counterweight shapes, discovering that hinged boxes transferred energy more efficiently than fixed masses. This wasn't guesswork, it was the scientific method in its infancy, with each siege serving as a live experiment. At the Siege of Acre, Mamluk engineers reportedly built scale models to test designs before committing to full-sized machines, a practice that wouldn't become standard in European engineering for another 400 years. Their notebooks, where they survived, reveal minds wrestling with problems any modern physicist would recognize. One Venetian engineer's sketches from 1345 show intricate diagrams calculating load distributions, with marginal notes speculating about the dance of forces within the machine. Another from Castile documented failed experiments with mixed counterweights, layers of sand atop lead, seeking the perfect balance between controlled descent and explosive power. These weren't just technical manuals, they were the first textbooks of applied mechanics, their authors unknowingly laying foundations for later giants like Leonardo da Vinci. The most sought-after engineers became medieval celebrities, their skills sparking bidding wars between rival lords. German mercenary Konrad von Eichstätt earned legendary status for designing trebuchets that could be disassembled and transported by wagon, the medieval equivalent of mobile artillery. His contract stipulated not just payment, but guarantees of protection for his team, showing how valued their expertise was. English records mention King John paying a Flemish engineer named Gerard the equivalent of 5 years' wages for a knight, just to oversee construction of a single machine during the Barons' War. What's often overlooked is how these innovators collaborated across cultures. Crusader sieges in the Holy Land brought European engineers into contact with Islamic scholars who'd preserved ancient Greek texts on mechanics. The result was a fusion of technologies, Byzantine rope-making techniques combined with Arabic mathematical precision and Frankish carpentry skills. At the Siege of Damietta during the Fifth Crusade, both sides reportedly had engineers who'd trained under the same master in Sicily, turning the battlefield into an ironic reunion of former colleagues. Their legacy extends far beyond warfare. The same principles they perfected, leverage, tension, and energy transfer, would later drive water mills, clock towers, and eventually industrial machinery. When James Watt refined the steam engine in the 18th century, he stood on the shoulders of these medieval tinkerers who first harnessed gravity's power. Even today, engineering students build miniature trebuchets to learn fundamental physics concepts, unknowingly replicating experiments conducted on muddy battlefields 8 centuries ago. Perhaps the greatest testament to their genius lies in how their machines outlasted them. Long after gunpowder made trebuchets obsolete, farmers across Europe continued using scaled-down versions to hurl rocks at wolves or clear fields, proving that true innovation never really disappears, it just finds new purposes. The medieval engineers who turned wood and rope into weapons of mass destruction would likely smile knowing their creations ended up protecting sheep and plowing soil. After all, they weren't just builders of war machines, they were problem solvers who happened to live in an age when the biggest problems required throwing very large stones very long distances. At first glance, catapults and trebuchets might seem like cousins in medieval warfare. Both hurl heavy objects through the air, both strike fear into defenders, both dominate castle sieges. But beneath the surface, they were as different as a musket and a modern rifle, separated by fundamental engineering principles that decided which weapon would dominate battlefields for centuries. The catapult's power came from torsion-twisted ropes or animal sinews stretched to their limits, storing energy like a coiled spring. When released, these sinews snapped back with violent force, flinging projectiles forward. It worked, but with glaring weaknesses. Moisture could loosen the ropes, temperature changes affected tension, and each shot degraded the materials. After a dozen throws, even the best catapult became unpredictable, its power waning like a wind-up toy running down. The trebuchet, by contrast, harnessed something far more reliable: the unwavering pull of gravity. That massive counterweight didn't tire, didn't stretch, didn't care if it rained or froze. Drop a 2-ton weight today, and it falls with the same force as it would a year from now. This consistency turned trebuchets into the precision instruments of medieval warfare. Where catapult crews had to constantly adjust for rope fatigue, trebuchet operators could fine-tune their machines like clockmakers, knowing each shot would behave like the last. Records from the Siege of Toulouse show trebuchets landing 5 consecutive stones within a pace of each other at 300 yards, a feat no torsion catapult could match. Power differentials were even more striking. While a large catapult might launch a 50-pound stone 200 yards, a trebuchet of similar size could hurl 3 times that weight half again as far. The difference lay in energy transfer. Twisted ropes waste power as friction and heat, while a falling weight channels nearly all its energy directly into the throw. Modern reconstructions prove this. A trebuchet's efficiency can exceed 80%, compared to a torsion engine's 30%. That extra power translated to real battlefield advantages. At the Siege of Acre, crusaders watched in horror as Mamluk trebuchets shattered Merlons their own catapults had barely chipped weeks earlier. Then there was the issue of endurance. Catapults were high-maintenance beasts, requiring teams to constantly re-twist ropes between shots. The Roman onager, a torsion catapult, needed 2 men with poles just to rewind its single arm after each throw. Trebuchets, by contrast, could cycle as fast as crews could reset the counterweight. Some accounts describe rates of 15 shots an hour, sustained for days. This relentless pace didn't just damage walls, it shattered morale. Defenders could endure sporadic catapult fire, but the rhythmic thunder of a trebuchet battery, counterweights crashing down every few minutes like a doomsday clock, wore down even the staunchest resolve. Yet perhaps the trebuchet's greatest advantage was adaptability. Catapults were essentially one-trick ponies designed for specific projectile weights. A machine built to throw 20-pound stones couldn't handle 50 without risking catastrophic failure. Trebuchets, with their adjustable counterweights and sling lengths, could switch between ammunition types effortlessly. The same machine might lob 100-pound boulders at walls in the morning, fire incendiary pots over parapets at noon, and fling dead livestock into water supplies by evening, a versatility that made them indispensable in prolonged sieges. This isn't to say catapults disappeared entirely. Smaller, mobile torsion engines found niches where portability mattered: field battles, naval warfare, or quick raids. But when kingdoms invested in serious siege works, they overwhelmingly chose trebuchets. The shift was so complete that by the 13th century, major castles stocked pre-cut trebuchet timbers as standard defense supplies, while catapult designs stagnated in military manuals. The trebuchet didn't just outperform its rivals, it redefined what siege warfare could be, transforming chaotic bombardments into calculated demolitions where physics, not luck, determined victory. And in that transformation lay the seeds of modern artillery, where consistency and precision matter far more than raw spectacle. The warwolf wasn't just large, it was a deliberate spectacle of intimidation, its very assembly serving as psychological warfare. As Scottish defenders at Stirling Castle watched English carpenters slowly raise this monstrosity beam by beam in 1304, they weren't just seeing a weapon take shape. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of Edward I's ruthless determination. Contemporary chronicles describe timber arriving by the wagonload for weeks, with specialized teams shaping the massive components on site. The throwing arm alone required 3 mature oak trees spliced together with iron bands. When completed, its counterweight box could hold over 4 tons of stone, capable of launching projectiles that shattered not just walls but the will to resist. Yet Warwolf had rivals in sheer scale. The bad neighbor Trebushe used during the siege of Acre stood nearly 60 feet tall, requiring 200 men just to operate its winding mechanisms. Unlike simpler designs where crews manually lifted the counterweight, this behemoth used a treadmill system with workers walking inside giant hamster wheel-like structures to raise its 10-ton counterweight between shots. The energy required was staggering. Modern calculations suggest each shot expended roughly the same kinetic energy as a speeding locomotive. And it wasn't alone. The Mamluks fielded an entire battery of these giants during their 13th century campaigns, their synchronized bombardments turning fortress walls into cascades of rubble. What made these super-sized machines so effective wasn't just their destructive capacity, but their theater of operation. Assembling a trebuchet of this scale within view of defenders became a calculated show of force, a medieval equivalent of nuclear deterrence. At the siege of Harlech Castle in Wales, the sight of Prince Edward's trebuchet components being unloaded reportedly prompted immediate surrender negotiations. The message was clear: resistance meant facing a machine that could methodically dismantle your strongest defenses stone by stone. Some commanders even staged demonstration shots before sieges began, hurling projectiles beyond walls to land harmlessly but spectacularly, proving their range and power without wasting ammunition on actual targets. Building these giants required unprecedented logistical support. The timber alone for one large trebuchet could deforest several acres, with specialized wood like slow-growth elm preferred for critical stress points. Iron fittings had to be forged on site by traveling blacksmiths, while ropes thicker than a man's arm were woven from hemp harvested years in advance to ensure proper curing. Accounts from the 100 Years' War describe supply trains stretching for miles just to deliver the nails, grease, and spare parts needed to keep these wooden titans operational. The workforce was equally specialized, not just carpenters and sappers, but mathematicians to calculate trajectories, quarrymen to shape consistent ammunition, and even scribes to document each shot's effect for tactical adjustments. Perhaps most impressive was how medieval engineers overcame the inherent vulnerabilities of such massive wooden structures. At that scale, the forces involved could literally shake the machine apart. Modern reconstructions show frames flexing several inches with each shot. Builders countered this through ingenious reinforcement, diagonal bracing that redistributed stress, iron straps at joint intersections, and even flexible joinery techniques borrowed from shipbuilding. The largest trebuchets incorporated suspension systems using woven rope nets to absorb recoil, while others mounted their entire frames on log rollers that allowed controlled movement with each shot. These weren't crude, oversized catapults. They were precision instruments scaled up to terrifying proportions. Their legacy endures in surprising ways. When engineers today design modern siege equipment like bunker-busting bombs or earthquake simulators, they still study Trebuchet principles of energy transfer. Even space agencies have experimented with Trebuchet-inspired launch systems for delivering payloads from planetary surfaces. But perhaps the most fitting tribute comes from Scottish folklore, where warwolf lives on not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of how human ingenuity can harness nature's fundamental forces for both creation and destruction on a monumental scale. The same physics that built cathedrals could also build the machines to tear them down. Transporting a trebuchet wasn't like moving a piece of furniture. It was more like relocating an entire wooden skyscraper, piece by painstaking piece. Armies on the march faced an impossible choice: build from scratch at each siege site and lose precious weeks, or haul pre-cut components across miles of treacherous terrain. The solution emerged in carefully numbered timber frames, with each beam marked like oversized puzzle pieces so illiterate laborers could assemble them correctly. Records from Edward I's Scottish campaigns describe wagon trains dedicated solely to trebuchet parts, axles wrapped in damp cloth to prevent cracking, ropes coiled in oiled leather to repel moisture, and iron fittings packed in straw to prevent rust. Even the counterweight stones were sometimes pre-shaped at quarries near the army's home base, their weight calculated to match specific machine designs. Assembly became a carefully choreographed dance of medieval engineering. Master builders would first select level ground. A slope of even a few degrees could throw off trajectories disastrously. Teams then erected the massive frame supports using mortise and tenon joints so precise they required no metal fasteners, the wood swelling with moisture to create an ever tighter fit over time. Rope crews worked simultaneously, braiding fresh hemp lines under tension to ensure no stretch during operation. What's astonishing is the speed achieved during the Siege of Acre in 1291. Mamluk engineers reportedly assembled a 60-foot-tall trebuchet in just 3 days, working around the clock by torchlight. Every component had to meet exacting standards. The throwing arm wasn't just a tree trunk, it was often laminated from multiple carefully selected timbers, their grain patterns aligned to prevent splitting under stress. Modern recreations show why this mattered. A poorly chosen arm could snap like a twig on the 10th shot, sending deadly shrapnel through the crew. Counterweight boxes required similar precision, their hinged bottoms designed to release cleanly without catching. At the Siege of Stirling, one account mentions engineers rejecting nearly a third of delivered timbers for minor imperfections that could compromise structural integrity. Tension adjustments separated adequate machines from lethal ones. Crews would spend hours after assembly, tuning their creation, adding or removing counterweight stones, adjusting sling lengths, and testing release mechanisms with sandbags before live ammunition. A manuscript from 1403 describes teams using water levels and plumb bobs to ensure perfect alignment, while others mention trial shots measured by pacing out distances. The margin for error was terrifyingly slim during the Siege of Toulouse. A misfired trebuchet collapsed backward, crushing 15 men in a tangle of snapping timbers and whipping ropes. Yet for all these challenges, field construction had hidden advantages. Local timber could supplement transported materials, with green wood sometimes preferred for its flexibility in certain components. Damaged parts were easily replaced without scrapping the entire machine. A luxury torsion catapults with their precisely tuned ropes didn't share. Most importantly, on-site building allowed customization to each siege's unique demands. Facing high walls, engineers might lengthen the throwing arm, need more rapid firing, they'd lighten the counterweight slightly. This adaptability made Trebuchets the Swiss Army knives of medieval artillery. The real marvel wasn't the machines themselves, but the human systems that created them. Guild-trained carpenters worked alongside peasant laborers under the watchful eyes of master engineers, transferring knowledge through shouted commands and hands-on demonstrations. Supply chains stretched across kingdoms to deliver specialized materials to muddy battlefields. All this effort for machines that might see only weeks of use before being abandoned or dismantled. A disposable colossus built with the care of a cathedral. When we look at trebuchets, we're not just seeing wooden weapons, we're witnessing the birth of project management, where logistics and craftsmanship met on the anvil of necessity. Operating a trebuchet at peak efficiency was like conducting a storm, equal parts precision and chaos. Even the mightiest machines faltered when rain soaked their hemp ropes, causing fibers to stretch unpredictably mid-shot. Chroniclers at the Siege of Kenilworth described projectiles veering wildly after summer downpours, forcing crews to halt operations for days while drying ropes by bonfires. Wind posed another invisible adversary, with gusts strong enough to push a 300-pound stone 10 paces off target, a nightmare for crews trying to methodically weaken castle walls. The most skilled engineers developed tricks to compensate, like adding extra twists to slings in high winds or loading slightly heavier projectiles in humid conditions, but nature always held the upper hand. The rhythm of reloading turned trebuchet warfare into a slow, brutal waltz. Unlike later cannons that could fire every minute, resetting a large trebuchet involved 15 backbreaking steps, from winching the multi-ton counterweight back into position to carefully placing the next projectile in its sling. Accounts from the siege of Acre mention crews working in rotating shifts to maintain a rate of 1 shot every 5 minutes, their hands raw from handling rough ropes hour after hour. This glacial pace gave defenders crucial windows to repair damage between volleys, forcing attackers to prolong sieges for weeks or months. Some commanders tried workarounds, like pre-loading multiple projectiles on wooden trays for faster reloading, but the fundamental physics of the machine refused to be rushed. Maintaining accuracy demanded constant, exhausting adjustments. As counterweight ropes stretched over hundreds of shots, crews had to add stones to compensate, a process requiring careful guesswork since no 2 ropes degraded at the same rate. The sling's release point would gradually wear down too, subtly changing trajectories until someone noticed impacts creeping off target. During the Siege of Toulouse, engineers kept chalkboards to track each machine's drift, adding or removing counterweight stones in precise increments like medieval gunsmiths calibrating rifles. Even the ground beneath the trebuchet became an enemy over time, as repeated recoil could shift the entire frame out of alignment, requiring teams to relevel the machine with wooden wedges. These limitations penned trebuchets into a specific tactical niche. Fast-moving field battles, impossible disassembling and transporting the machines took days. Surprise attacks, forget it. The thunderous crash of a counterweight dropping gave defenders ample warning. They excelled only in the chess match of prolonged sieges, where patience mattered more than speed. That's why you'll never read of trebuchets at Agincourt or Hastings. They were the sledgehammers of medieval warfare, useless for anything but methodically pounding fixed targets. Yet in their imperfections lay unexpected advantages. The slow reload allowed commanders to assess damage between shots, adjusting targets like artillery spotters centuries before the term existed. Weather vulnerabilities forced engineers to develop protective tarps and rope treatments that later benefited sailing ships. Even the machine's immobility spurred innovations in castle design, as architects realized rounded walls could deflect shots better than flat surfaces. a revelation that birthed the iconic curved towers of late medieval fortresses. The Trebuchets' flaws didn't just hinder warfare, they shaped its evolution, proving that even limitations can become catalysts for ingenuity. The rise of Trebuchets didn't just change how wars were fought, it forced castle builders to rethink centuries of defensive wisdom virtually overnight. Those towering stone walls that once seemed impregnable now crumbled under relentless barrages, sending architects scrambling for solutions, the most obvious response. Bulk walls that had stood 3 feet thick suddenly doubled to 6 or even 10 feet in vulnerable spots, their surfaces often faced with harder stone to resist cracking. At Chateau-Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart pioneered stepped-back walls layers of masonry where each level jutted slightly forward, forcing incoming projectiles to strike at oblique angles that dissipated their energy. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were calculated physics experiments in stone, each modification a direct response to trebuchet impacts observed at other sieges. But thickness alone couldn't solve the problem. Engineers soon realized rounded towers withstood bombardment far better than traditional square designs. The curved surfaces caused stones to glance off rather than strike head-on, while the circular shape eliminated weak corner joints that trebuchet shots loved to exploit. Walk through any 13th century castle like Conway or Caernarfon, and you'll see this revolution frozen in stone towers that look almost organic, their smooth contours belying their deadly purpose. Some designs took it further, creating multi-angled bastions where every surface deflected shots toward harmless ground. The old square keeps didn't disappear overnight, but their days as military gold standards were numbered the moment trebuchets began dominating battlefields. Moats underwent their own transformation. What had been simple ditches became sprawling engineered barriers, some over 100 feet wide with steep, masonry-lined sides. At Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, Crusader knights created a water-filled moat so vast it effectively put their walls beyond the maximum range of contemporary trebuchets. Other castles employed dry moats with sheer drops, forcing attackers to build their siege engines dangerously close under arrow fire. The moat wasn't just a barrier anymore, it was a carefully calculated no-man's land where trebuchets lost their advantage. The most ingenious countermeasures came from castles fighting fire with fire. Forward-thinking lords began incorporating trebuchet platforms into their own designs, not just for counter-battery fire, but as psychological weapons. Imagine attacking a fortress only to see its defenders winching down their own massive counterweights. Dover Castle's concentric walls featured specially reinforced towers with rotating turntables, allowing defensive trebuchets to pivot and engage threats from any direction. At Margat Castle in Syria, archaeologists found evidence of a permanent trebuchet emplacement with a stone ammunition magazine built right into the wall, medieval defense taken to industrial levels. This arms race produced some truly bizarre innovations. At Carcassonne, engineers designed false weak spots, sections of wall deliberately built slightly thinner to lure trebuchet crews into wasting ammunition. Others experimented with external wooden galleries that absorbed hits while protecting the stone beneath, like medieval shock absorbers. A few castles even hung heavy curtains of wet hides over vulnerable areas, using the pliable material to deaden impact. Every siege became a laboratory, with defenders scrutinizing each new bombardment for clues to improve their designs. What emerged from this centuries-long duel was a new philosophy of defense, one that accepted no wall was truly impregnable, but could be made so costly to breach that attackers would abandon the effort. The trebuchet hadn't just changed castles, it had changed how people thought about security itself. No longer just symbols of power, fortresses became dynamic systems designed to outthink as much as outlast. And as we'll see, that shift in thinking would echo far beyond the medieval world, influencing everything from naval warfare to modern bunker design. The Trebuchet's true legacy wasn't destruction, it was the relentless innovation it forced upon those who sought to resist it. The thunder of gunpowder marked the beginning of the end for trebuchets, but not their sudden extinction. When cannons first rumbled onto medieval battlefields in the 14th century, they brought shocking advantages: compact size allowing movement with armies, earth-shaking noise terrifying defenders, and the ability to fire through rain or shine without losing power. Yet for all their flash, early artillery had dirty secrets. Their iron barrels frequently burst under pressure, killing their own crews. Accuracy was laughable by trebuchet standards, with some shots veering wildly enough to miss entire castles. And the cost, prohibitively expensive compared to good old wood and rope. That's why at the siege of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans still deployed massive trebuchets alongside their famed bombards, recognizing that sometimes brute mechanical reliability trumped cutting-edge technology. This overlap period reveals fascinating adaptations in trebuchet design as engineers scrambled to remain relevant. Some crews shortened throwing arms for higher trajectories, lobbing shots over new-style low walls designed to deflect cannon fire. Others experimented with hybrid designs, like the springled, a torsion-assisted trebuchet that borrowed gunpowder's compactness while retaining gravity's consistency. Records from the War of the Roses mention trebuchets mounted on reinforced carts for mobility, their crews learning from artillery's flexibility. But the most telling innovation came in ammunition, where trebuchets began launching hollow clay pots filled with black powder, creating improvised explosive shells decades before fragmentation rounds became standard in cannons. What finally tipped the scales wasn't raw power, but logistics and psychology. A cannon crew could fire 20 shots in the time a trebuchet launched one, their rapid barrage overwhelming defenders' ability to repair damage. Gunpowder weapons also didn't require the sprawling clearings trebuchets needed, allowing besiegers to nestle cannons uncomfortably close to walls under cover of darkness. Perhaps most crucially, the sulphurous stench and deafening roar of artillery shattered morale in ways silent arcing stones never could. At the Siege of Malaga in 1487, Spanish chroniclers noted how defenders panicked at cannon fire but endured trebuchet bombardment with grim resignation, proof that terror, not just physics, decided which weapons survived. Yet the transition wasn't purely technological, it was economic. Maintaining a trebuchet army required vast timber reserves and skilled carpenters, resources growing scarce as Europe's forests dwindled. Meanwhile, gunpowder production centralized under royal control, with kings preferring weapons that couldn't be easily replicated by rebellious nobles. By the 1520s, trebuchets had become museum pieces in most of Europe, though intriguingly, they persisted in regions like Japan and India where gunpowder arrived later. The last recorded military use in Europe came surprisingly late during the Siege of Malta in 1565. The Knights Hospitaller reportedly dusted off old trebuchet designs when Ottoman blockades cut off their gunpowder supply. What's often overlooked is how trebuchet knowledge didn't disappear, it transformed. The same master carpenters who once built siege engines found work constructing water mills and cathedral cranes, applying their understanding of leverage and counterweights to peaceful purposes. Military engineers adapted trebuchet mathematics to calculate artillery trajectories, realizing the old machines had essentially been teaching ballistics all along. Even today, the trebuchet spirit lives on in surprising places, from playground seesaws demonstrating mechanical advantage to space agency prototypes testing low-gravity launching systems. The machines didn't so much become obsolete as evolve, their DNA woven into technologies their medieval creators could never have imagined. The real lesson of the Trebuchet's decline isn't about superiority, but specialization. For 5 centuries, these wooden giants reigned because they perfectly matched their time when sieges were slow, walls were high, and physics was the most reliable weapon available. Gunpowder didn't make them obsolete because it was better in every way, but because warfare itself changed around them. In that way, trebuchets stand as a reminder that all technology, no matter how brilliant, eventually meets its match, not in a rival invention, but in a world that no longer needs what it was built to do. Modern trebuchet builders face a puzzle medieval engineers never imagined recreating ancient war machines under the scrutiny of physics equations and safety regulations. At Warwick Castle in England, a team spent 2 years constructing a 60-foot-tall replica using only 13th century tools and techniques. Their finished machine could hurl a 15-pound stone nearly 200 yards, but the real discovery came when they tried adjusting the sling length by just 3 inches. That tiny change added 30 feet to the throw, revealing how precise historical builders had to be without modern measuring devices. These replicas aren't just museum pieces, they're time machines that let us reverse engineer medieval thought processes through trial and error. Competitive trebuchet events have turned this historical curiosity into a global phenomenon. The annual Pumpkin Chunkin Festival in Delaware sees teams firing pumpkins over half a mile using scaled-down versions, with some enthusiasts employing laser rangefinders and computer simulations to optimize their designs. Yet the most impressive feats come from groups sticking strictly to historical methods. A French team recently broke the world record for a human-powered trebuchet, no modern materials allowed, by launching a 55-pound projectile 300 feet using only wood, rope, and sheer physics mastery. Their secret, a swinging counterweight design rediscovered from a 14th century manuscript that nearly doubles energy transfer efficiency. What these modern experiments reveal is how much we've underestimated medieval engineering. When MIT students built a trebuchet based on historical plans, they assumed it would take weeks to achieve consistent accuracy. Instead, the machine landed 5 consecutive shots within a 3-foot circle on its first day. Proof that ancient designs were far more refined than textbooks suggested. Some replicas have even corrected historical assumptions. A German team discovered that certain groove patterns carved into throwing arms weren't decorative as previously thought, but carefully calculated release guides that function like primitive ballistic computers. The educational value extends far beyond physics demonstrations. At the University of Copenhagen, archaeology students build miniature trebuchets to study how different ammunition types would have affected medieval battles. Their experiments with replica clay firepots showed how certain designs would ignite mid-flight, solving a long-standing debate about historical accounts of flaming arcs during sieges. Meanwhile, in Japan, traditional carpenters used trebuchet construction to preserve nearly extinct woodworking techniques, from complex scarf joints to tension-based assembly methods that predate nails. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this revival is how it bridges past and present technologies. NASA engineers recently studied trebuchet mechanics for potential use in low-gravity environments, while amusement park designers borrow their smooth acceleration principles for next-generation thrill rides. The medieval war machine that once terrified castle garrisons now teaches robotic students about energy transfer and helps architects understand structural stresses in skyscrapers. Every time a modern trebuchet arm swings, it proves that good engineering transcends eras, whether the goal is breaching walls or breaking distance records. the fundamental dance between mass, leverage, and timing remains unchanged. These replicas do more than recreate history. They keep alive an entire philosophy of problem solving. Watching a team of engineers and historians debate the exact angle of a release pin or the ideal moisture content for rope isn't just academic. It's the same collaborative process medieval builders used when sharing hard-won knowledge across generations. In an age of instant digital solutions, there's something profoundly grounding about seeing modern minds wrestle with the same physical constraints their ancestors faced, discovering through hands-on experience what old manuscripts could never fully explain. The Trebuchet's journey from siege engine to teaching tool reminds us that sometimes the best way forward is to look backward, with fresh eyes and renewed respect for the ingenuity of those who came before. Hollywood has a knack for turning trebuchets into blockbuster stars, often at the expense of historical accuracy. In Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, the Siege of Minas Tirith features trebuchets launching flaming projectiles in rapid succession. A dramatic spectacle, but far from the slow, methodical pace of real medieval warfare. These cinematic liberties aren't just about flair. They tap into the trebuchet's primal appeal as an underdog weapon, a symbol of ingenuity overcoming impossible odds. Game of Thrones took it further, with Daenerys' dragons obliterating a trebuchet in mid-swing, a visual feast that, while physically implausible, cemented the machine's reputation as an icon of siege warfare in popular imagination. Video games have arguably done more to preserve the trebuchet's legacy than any history textbook. Franchises like Age of Empires and Total War don't just include trebuchets, they make them pivotal to gameplay. In Age of Empires Roman II, players quickly learn that rushing a trebuchet into battle too soon can be disastrous, mirroring the real-world logistical challenges medieval commanders faced. The game's accuracy surprises even historians. Trebuchets require careful setup, can't fire rapidly, and become vulnerable once their positions are revealed. These mechanics subtly teach players the same tactical patience that defined actual medieval sieges, all while they're focused on crushing pixelated castles. But pop culture's love affair with trebuchets isn't just about destruction, it's about problem solving. The Mythbusters episode testing trebuchet effectiveness drew millions of viewers, not for its explosions, though those helped, but for its painstaking detail in recreating medieval engineering. When their replica hurled a piano across a field, it wasn't just a stunt. It demonstrated the machine's terrifying potential with tangible, visceral impact. Even comedy gets in on the action Monty Python, and the Holy Grail's absurdist take, with knights debating whether a projectile could be considered a valid form of government, ironically highlights how trebuchets symbolized authority in the Middle Ages. These portrayals, exaggerated or not, serve a deeper purpose. They keep the trebuchet relevant in a world far removed from castle warfare. When a Minecraft player builds a working trebuchet to fling TNT at their friends, they're engaging with the same principles of leverage and trajectory that medieval engineers mastered. Tabletop games like Warhammer distill trebuchets into stat blocks and dice rolls, yet still capture their role as battlefield game changers. The machine's transition from siege engine to cultural touchstone proves some designs are timeless, whether rendered in pixels, plastic, or IMAX spectacle. What's fascinating is how these modern interpretations sometimes circle back to influence historical understanding. After Stronghold, Crusader popularized trebuchet mechanics in gaming. Museums reported increased visitor questions about counterweight systems. Cosplayers at Renaissance fairs now build functional mini trebuchets, blending historical passion with hands-on physics. Even the meme culture's obsession with trebuchets, like the viral debate over whether they're superior to catapults has sparked unexpected interest in medieval engineering among digital natives. The Trebuchet's journey from battlefield to pop culture proves that great design transcends its original purpose, becoming a canvas for storytelling, education, and even humor across generations. Contrary to dramatic movie scenes, trebuchets were never medieval human catapults. Those tales of knights soaring over castle walls make for great spectacle but terrible history. The physics simply wouldn't allow it. Launching a 200-pound armored man would require a counterweight heavier than the machine itself, not to mention the lethal G-forces involved. Historical records mention all sorts of projectile stones, fire parts, even plague victims, but never human cargo. This persistent myth likely stems from romanticized medieval illustrations and modern filmmakers prioritizing excitement over accuracy. The reality was far more calculated. Why waste precious siege time on a single random knight when you could systematically demolish an entire wall section with precisely placed boulders? Another widespread misconception paints trebuchets as unstoppable war machines that never failed. The truth, these wooden giants were as temperamental as they were powerful. Manuscripts from the 100 Years' War describe frames cracking under repeated recoil, slings snapping mid-throw to send projectiles crashing into friendly troops, and counterweight ropes fraying after just days of use. At the Siege of Harfleur, Henry V's forces lost 3 trebuchets to structural failures before completing their bombardment. Even well-built machines required constant maintenance, greasing axles, replacing worn ropes, and rebalancing arms as timber absorbed moisture and warp. The idea of trebuchets as flawless engines of destruction ignores the gritty reality of medieval engineering. Every shot carried the risk of catastrophic failure. Perhaps the most misleading myth suggests any medieval army could whip up a trebuchet from nearby trees. While Hollywood shows peasants assembling these machines in hours, actual construction demanded specialized knowledge and rare materials. Master engineers guarded their designs like state secrets, knowing incorrect proportions could render a machine useless. The timber alone needed careful selection: slow-growth oak for the arm, flexible elm for the frame, often transported miles to the siege site. Iron fittings had to be forged by experienced blacksmiths using scarce metal reserves. Even the counterweight stones weren't just random boulders. Quarriers shaped them into consistent weights to maintain firing precision. Accounts from the Crusades mention sieges delayed for weeks while crews waited for skilled carpenters to arrive. These misconceptions don't just distort history, they cheapen the real innovation behind trebuchets. By imagining them as simple or infallible, we overlook the generations of trial and error that perfected their designs. When modern engineers recreate these machines using medieval techniques, they're consistently stunned by the precision required. A quarter-inch difference in the pivot point can turn a wall breaker into a useless pile of timber. That's the true legacy of the trebuchet, not as a crude brute force weapon, but as a testament to how medieval minds harnessed physics through observation, craftsmanship, and painstaking refinement. The next time you see one in a movie launching cows or knights, remember the reality was far more impressive. Modern physics has peeled back the layers of trebuchet mechanics to reveal a hidden world of mathematical elegance. When researchers plug medieval designs into equations for torque and projectile motion, something remarkable happens. The numbers align almost perfectly with what today's textbooks prescribe. Take the golden ratio many trebuchet builders arrived at: a throwing arm roughly 3.5 times longer on the projectile side than the counterweight side. Crunch the physics, and this proportion emerges as the ideal balance between rotational force and control. Medieval engineers didn't have calculus or vector diagrams, but but through generations of trial and error, they honed in on these optimal ratios with uncanny precision. The mathematics of energy transfer in these machines is particularly striking. A falling counterweight converts potential energy into kinetic energy through the throwing arm, acting as a giant lever. Modern reconstructions show efficiency rates upwards of 80%, meaning most of that gravitational energy translates directly into projectile motion with minimal waste. Compare that to early catapults, which lost over half their energy to friction and heat from twisted ropes. What's truly impressive is how medieval builders maximized this transfer without understanding Joule's or Newton's laws. They simply observed that certain wood types flexed just enough without breaking, that specific joint angles transferred force more smoothly, and that carefully shaped release points gave projectiles that final critical whip. Projectile motion calculations reveal even more sophistication. The ideal launch angle for maximum distance, 45 degrees, a fact Trebuchet operators discovered empirically long before Galileo formalized parabolic trajectories. But here's where it gets fascinating. Medieval engineers realized real-world conditions demanded adjustments. Against high castle walls, they'd increase the angle to 60 degrees for plunging shots. When needing to punch through thick gates, they'd flatten trajectories to 30 degrees for direct impact. These weren't random guesses, they were the results of meticulous record-keeping, with siege masters reportedly noting down ranges and impacts like early artillery spotters. Modern labs have tested these observations with high-speed cameras and motion sensors. One study at the University of Oxford reconstructed a 12-foot trebuchet based on 14th century designs. When they plotted the projectile's path, it matched nearly perfectly with computer models of ideal parabolic motion, except for one brilliant adaptation. Medieval sling release mechanisms actually impart a slight topspin to stones, stabilizing their flight much like a quarterback's spiral pass. This subtle innovation, born entirely from practical experience, reduces air resistance and improves accuracy by up to 15%, a detail modern physicists only recently quantified with fluid dynamic simulations. The numbers behind counterweight sizing tell an equally compelling story. Through painstaking experimentation, builders arrived at counterweights 100 to 150 times heavier than their projectiles for optimal performance. Too light and stones wouldn't reach walls, too heavy, and the machine risked self-destruction. What's astonishing is how closely this ratio aligns with modern torque calculations for rotating lever arms. At Warwick Castle's reconstruction project, engineers found deviating from these medieval proportions by just 10% either way caused dramatic losses in range or accuracy, proof of how precisely historical designs were calibrated. Perhaps the most humbling realization comes from studying energy outputs. A large Trebuchet's counterweight falling 15 feet generates over 30,000 foot-pounds of energy equivalent to a car crashing at 20 miles per hour. Channeling that raw power into a controlled throw required understanding concepts like impulse and momentum long before they had names. When reconstructed trebuchets launch projectiles that embed themselves several feet into solid oak targets, we're witnessing the same principles that guide modern railguns and space launch systems, just written in wood and stone rather than equations. This mathematical harmony between medieval practice and modern theory doesn't just validate historical engineering, it challenges our assumptions about technological progress. Those Dark Age builders weren't just lucky guessers. They were keen observers who refined their craft through systematic experimentation. Every perfectly placed castle strike, every adjusted sling length, every weighted stone represented a data point in humanity's slow unraveling of physics mysteries. The trebuchet stands as proof that scientific understanding can emerge from hands-on craftsmanship as surely as from laboratory experiments, that the language of mathematics speaks through practice as clearly as through theory. While trebuchets earned their fame smashing castle walls, their engineering brilliance found unexpected purpose far from battlefields. In the silver mines of medieval Saxony, modified trebuchet mechanisms powered ore-crushing stamp mills. Their counterweights adapted to lift heavy hammers that pulverized rock with rhythmic efficiency. Construction sites from Chartres to Cologne employed smaller versions as primitive cranes, using controlled drops of counterweights to hoist massive stone blocks into place for cathedral walls. The same physics that could fling a boulder 300 yards could also gently raise a 2-ton carved saint to perch atop a spire, destruction and creation sharing the same mechanical DNA. Festivals and royal pageants transformed these weapons into instruments of wonder. Burgundian court records describe a joyous trebuchet that showered nobles with rose petals and gold coins during wedding celebrations, its sling modified to open at the peak of its arc for a dazzling aerial display. In Ming Dynasty China, engineers built trebuchets specifically for fireworks, launching gunpowder-packed projectiles that ignited mid-flight to paint the night sky with fiery dragons. Even the Vatican got in on the act. Pope Pius Roman II chronicler describes a Vatican City spectacle where a trebuchet lobbed perfumed oranges into crowds during Easter festivities, turning war machine into a romantic carnival attraction. Perhaps most surprising were trebuchets' agricultural adaptations. Dutch windmill engineers borrowed the counterweight principle to create self-regulating grain mills that adjusted to changing wind speeds. Vineyard owners in medieval France used miniature versions to hurl bags of fertilizer across otherwise inaccessible terraced fields. A 15th-century manuscript from Tuscany even details a trebuchet-powered olive harvester that shook trees with precisely timed impacts, an early example of mechanized farming that wouldn't be matched until the Industrial Revolution. This civilian repurposing reveals the trebuchet's true legacy, not as a weapon, but as medieval Europe's first multi-purpose power source. Before steam engines or electricity, these machines represented one of the few ways to harness and direct massive energy on demand. When a Bolognese architect used a trebuchet's mechanism to test building materials, dropping weights onto stone samples to measure their load-bearing capacity, he was conducting stress tests centuries before modern engineering labs. The same principles would later inspire grandfather clocks, pendulum systems, and even early industrial looms. What began as a tool of war became a canvas for peacetime innovation because its core design solved a fundamental human problem: how to transform gravity's relentless pull into controlled, repeatable force. Whether launching celebratory fireworks or lifting cathedral stones, trebuchets proved that engineering's highest purpose isn't destruction, it's the endless reinvention of possibility. And in that transformation, these medieval machines whisper an enduring truth. Any technology's noblest application is measured not by what it can break, but by what it can build. The trebuchet's true engineering legacy isn't found in dusty history books. It lives on in the skeletal arms of construction cranes swinging across city skylines. Those same principles medieval craftsmen carved into wood now support steel beams 20 stories high, proving that 12th century physics still holds modern weight. Consider how modern tower cranes operate. A massive counterbalance offsets the load, just like a trebuchet's weight box, while the jib's length determines reach and controlled direct descendants of the throwing arm's carefully calculated proportions. Even the safety mechanisms preventing overloads echo trebuchet builders' intuitive understanding of torque limits. When a crane operator today smoothly lifts a 5-ton concrete slab, they're performing a ballet of forces first choreographed by siege engineers 8 centuries ago. Energy transfer, the Trebuchet's most brilliant innovation, became the cornerstone of industrial machinery. James Watt's steam engine breakthrough wasn't just about creating power, but controlling its delivery through piston strokes carefully calibrated like a Trebuchet's counterweight drop. Modern power plants use similar principles in flywheel energy storage systems, where massive rotating disks act like perpetual counterweights, absorbing and releasing energy with the same precision medieval engineers achieved through ropes and gravity. Even regenerative braking in electric cars owes a conceptual debt to these ancient machines capturing kinetic energy that would otherwise be lost, just as Trebuchet designers minimized wasted motion through balanced arms and smooth releases. The mathematics behind Trebuchet projectile arcs didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. They launched entire fields of study. Renaissance scientists like Tartaglia and Galileo built upon these observed trajectories to formalize parabolic motion equations, while artillery officers during the Napoleonic Wars carried range tables directly derived from medieval firing patterns. Today's rocket scientists still use modified versions of these calculations for orbital insertion burns, proving that the path from castle walls to spaceflight is more direct than we imagine. When NASA engineers plot spacecraft trajectories, they're refining the same principles a Trebuchet crew used to estimate how much extra counterweight would add 30 paces to their range. Modern materials testing reveals another surprising connection. The rhythmic stress Trebuchet frames endured, wood fibers flexing under each shot, mirrors the fatigue testing performed today on aircraft wings and bridge supports. Medieval engineers unknowingly pioneered early durability studies by observing which joints cracked first and reinforcing them in subsequent designs. Contemporary engineers at firms like Boeing and Siemens use this same empirical approach, combining computer models with physical stress tests that echo Trebuchet builders' trial and error refinement. The iron bands reinforcing throwing arms were medieval predecessors to the carbon fiber wraps, strengthening modern turbine blades. Different materials, identical philosophy. Even in robotics and automation, the Trebuchet's influence persists. The precise timing required for sling release finds new life in industrial pick and place machines, where milliseconds determine successful operations. Boston Dynamics' Atlas robot performs dynamic lifts using balance principles that would feel familiar to any Trebuchet operator adjusting for an uneven loading platform. And in warehouse automation, those algorithms directing robotic arms to fling packages onto conveyor belts, they're running calculations strikingly similar to those a medieval engineer might have scratched in the dirt to determine release angles. Perhaps most poetic is how Trebuchet mechanics now teach future engineers. Universities worldwide use scaled-down models in introductory physics courses to demonstrate energy conversion, while engineering competitions challenge students to optimize designs using the same constraints medieval builders faced. When an MIT team recently broke the world record for a pumpkin-throwing trebuchet, they did so by rediscovering a 14th-century hinged counterweight design that outperformed all their computer-optimized modern variants, a humbling reminder that innovation isn't always about new ideas, but sometimes about remembering old ones. The trebuchet's greatest lesson might be this: true engineering genius transcends its original purpose. What began as a weapon to breach walls became a masterclass in efficient energy use, precision timing, and adaptive design principles that now underpin everything from skyscrapers to space exploration. Those medieval craftsmen working with hand tools and intuition were laying foundations for technologies they couldn't possibly envision, proving that progress isn't a straight line but an arc, one that, like a well-tuned trebuchet shot, lands right where it needs to be. Building your own mini trebuchet isn't just a craft project, it's a crash course in medieval engineering that fits on your kitchen table. Start with the frame. Sturdy popsicle sticks glued into a shape create the foundation, mimicking those massive timber supports that held historic siege machines upright. The real magic happens when you add the throwing arm. A skewer or pencil works perfectly, pivoting on a smooth metal brad that serves as your miniature axle. Here's where physics gets hands-on. Tape a small container, think film canister or bottle cap, to the short end for your counterweight, while attaching a string and pouch sling to the longer arm. That critical ratio medieval engineers perfected. You'll discover it firsthand when your first few test shots plop pathetically until you adjust the arm's pivot point or sling length by mere millimeters. Counterweight selection becomes an experiment in energy transfer. Pennies work for light projectiles like raisins or paper balls, but upgrade to metal nuts or washers when you're ready to launch mini marshmallows across the room. The beauty lies in the trial and error. Each misfire teaches you what those medieval builders knew instinctively. Too much weight, your frame collapses. Too little, the projectile barely budges. Online templates help, but the real learning comes when you start tweaking. Double the counterweight and see how range increases, but only up to a point where the frame can't handle the stress. That's the same balancing act engineers faced when scaling up to castle-smashing sizes. Modern hobbyists have elevated this from school science fair project to precision art. Serious builders use laser-cut birch plywood for frames, fishing line for near-frictionless guide strings, and even 3D printed release mechanisms for consistent throws. Some competitive models can fling a grape over 50 feet with startling accuracy, proving these aren't toys but scaled-down demonstrations of real ballistics. Kits like the Da Vinci Trebuchet include historically accurate touches like adjustable counterweight boxes and leather slings, letting you experiment like a 15th century siege master. The most rewarding moment comes when you finally nail the release timing. Watch in slow motion as your counterweight drops, the arm whips forward, and the sling's loop slips off its pin at exactly 45 degrees, just like the full-sized originals. When that first perfect shot arcs through the air and nails your target, a cup, a drawing of a castle, your unsuspecting sibling, you're not just throwing a projectile. You're channeling 8 centuries of mechanical innovation, one popsicle stick at a time, and who knows, that coffee table siege engine might just spark a lifetime fascination with the physics hidden in everyday objects, the same curiosity that turned medieval carpenters into the rocket scientists of their age. Trebuchet competitions have evolved into the ultimate proving grounds where medieval engineering meets modern ingenuity. At events like the legendary Pumpkin Chunkin in Delaware, teams push the boundaries of what these ancient machines can do, hurling pumpkins nearly 3,000 feet through the air using designs that would make 13th century builders gasp. The secret to these record-breaking throws often lies in clever twists on traditional concepts, like floating arm trebuchets where the counterweight drops vertically along guides to maximize energy transfer. Other teams experiment with hybrid models incorporating everything from bungee cords to pneumatic assists, blending old-world mechanics with space-age materials like carbon fiber arms and Kevlar slings. What makes these contests so fascinating isn't just the spectacle of flying gourds, it's how they reveal universal engineering truths. When a team from MIT analyzed centuries-old trebuchet manuscripts, they discovered their optimal computer-designed ratios matched those medieval builders arrived at through trial and error. Competitions have become living laboratories where physics students test theories against backyard tinkerers' hard-won experience, often with surprising results. In 2019, a high school team using a simple hinged counterweight, a design documented in a 14th century siege manual, outperformed university teams with high-tech models, proving sometimes history holds the best solutions. The creativity on display would impress even the most seasoned medieval engineers. One team built a trebuchet on a floating platform to absorb recoil like a naval cannon, while another designed a walking beam model that literally steps forward with each shot to add momentum. At the European Trebuchet Championship, a Swiss team's machine uses laser-guided release timing, adjusting sling separation down to the millisecond based on wind speed sensors. Yet for all this innovation, the fundamental challenge remains unchanged: harnessing gravity's relentless pull with nothing but leverage, timing, and a little bit of magic. Beyond the hardware, these events keep ancient craftsmanship alive in unexpected ways. Traditional rope makers demonstrate how medieval hemp twisting techniques create slings that outperform synthetic cords, while blacksmiths forge release mechanisms using methods unchanged since the Crusades. The most successful teams often pair engineering degrees with hands-on woodworking skills, a rare combination in our digital age that echoes the guild system where knowledge passed from master to apprentice. When a 70-year-old shipwright helps a teenager carve the perfect throwing arm, it's more than just teamwork, it's a thread connecting 8 centuries of mechanical wisdom. What began as niche gatherings have grown into global phenomena, with competitions from Japan to South Africa attracting thousands. Some focus on pure distance, others on precision, like hitting a target the size of a castle window at 200 yards. The annual Château des Box tournament in France even requires teams to use only medieval tools and materials, turning the event into part engineering challenge, part historical reenactment. These contests prove the trebuchet isn't just a relic. It's a timeless puzzle that continues to inspire new generations to ask the same question medieval builders did: how can we make gravity work for us? The true legacy of these competitions lies in their ability to turn physics into pure joy. There's something primal about watching a carefully balanced machine transform potential energy into soaring motion, whether it's launching pumpkins, watermelons, or the occasional piano. As crowds cheer each thunderous release and groan at near misses, they're participating in a tradition that stretches back to castle sieges where entire armies would pause to watch a master engineer's latest shot. The machines may be more sophisticated now, but the thrill remains unchanged: that perfect moment when calculation meets chaos, and for one glorious arc through the sky, history feels alive again. The trebuchet stands as one of history's most fascinating paradoxes, a weapon of war that became a masterpiece of engineering, a tool of destruction that advanced human understanding. When we look at those massive wooden frames, we're not just seeing medieval artillery, we're witnessing the moment humanity began bending physics to its will. Every perfectly placed stone, every adjusted counterweight, every reinforced joint represented a leap forward in applied science, centuries before the formal scientific method existed. These machines didn't just break castle walls, they shattered the limits of what people believed was possible with wood, rope, and sheer ingenuity. What makes the trebuchet truly remarkable is how its influence echoes far beyond the battlefields where it earned its fame. The same principles that powered its throwing arm now help engineers design construction cranes that shape our skylines. The careful energy transfer medieval builders perfected through trial and error finds new life in modern renewable energy systems. Even space agencies study trebuchet mechanics when designing launch systems for low-gravity environments. This isn't just ancient history, it's living knowledge repurposed for every age. Yet perhaps the trebuchet's greatest legacy is how it challenges our assumptions about the past. Too often, we dismiss the Middle Ages as a backward time, forgetting that amid the chaos of feudalism and warfare, minds were solving problems with breathtaking sophistication. When a master engineer adjusted a Trebuchet's release pin by a fraction of an inch to improve accuracy, he was conducting physics research as valid as any modern lab experiment, just written in splintered wood and flying stone rather than equations. Next time you encounter a castle ruin or see a trebuchet replica at a Renaissance fair, take a moment to appreciate the hidden genius behind its design. That weathered wooden frame contains centuries of accumulated knowledge, each component refined through generations of observation and adaptation. It reminds us that innovation isn't always about inventing something new. Sometimes it's about perfecting what already exists, whether you're a medieval carpenter or a modern engineer. If this journey through trebuchet history sparked your curiosity, you're not alone. There's a reason these machines captivate us centuries after their last battle. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have been a master builder, a fearless operator, or the poor soul tasked with hauling counterweight stones? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden engineering marvels. Until next time, keep looking at the world with wonder, because even the most ordinary objects might just have extraordinary stories.